Leviticus chapter 7. This is the ritual for the sacrifice of reparation, it is especially holy. The victim must be slaughtered where the burnt offerings are slaughtered, and the priest will pour the blood all around the altar. He will then offer all the fat, the tail, the fat covering the entrails, both kidneys, the fat on them and on the loins, the mass of fat which he will remove from the liver and kidneys. The priest will burn these pieces on the altar as food burnt for Yahweh. This is a sacrifice of reparation. Every male who is a priest may eat it. It will be eaten inside the holy place, it is especially holy. As with the sacrifice for sin, so with the sacrifice of reparation, the ritual is the same for both. The offering with which the priest performs the rite of expiation will revert to the priest. The hide of the victim presented by someone to the priest to be offered as a burnt offering will revert to the priest. Every cereal offering baked in the oven, every cereal offering cooked in the pan or on the griddle will revert to the priest who offers it. Every cereal offering, mixed with oil or dry, will revert to all the descendants of Aaron without distinction. This is the ritual for the communion sacrifice to be offered to Yahweh. If this is offered as a sacrifice with praise, to the latter must be added an offering of unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers spread with oil, and wheaten flour in the form of cakes mixed with oil. This offering, then, must be added to the cakes of leavened bread and to the communion sacrifice with praise. One of the cakes of this offering must be presented as an offering to Yahweh, it will revert to the priest who pours out the blood of the communion sacrifice. The meat of the victim will be eaten on the day the offering is made, nothing may be left until next morning. If the victim is offered as a votive or a voluntary sacrifice, it must be eaten on the day it is offered, and the remainder may be eaten on the following day, but on the third day whatever is left of the meat of the victim must be burnt. If any of the meat of a victim offered as a communion sacrifice is eaten on the third day, the person who has offered it will not be acceptable and will receive no credit for it. It will count as rotten meat, and the person who eats it will bear the consequences of the guilt. Meat that has touched anything unclean cannot be eaten, it must be burnt. Anyone clean may eat the meat, but anyone unclean who eats the meat of a communion sacrifice offered to Yahweh will be outlawed from his people. Furthermore, if anyone touches anything unclean, human or animal, or any foul thing, and then eats the meat of a communion sacrifice offered to Yahweh, that individual will be outlawed from his people. Single quote. Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, "Speak to the Israelites and say, you may not eat the fat of ox, sheep or goat. The fat of an animal that has died a natural death or been savaged by beasts may be used for any other purpose, but you are not to eat it. Anyone who eats the fat of an animal offered as food burnt for Yahweh will be outlawed from his people. Wherever you live, you will never eat blood, whether it be of bird or of beast. Anyone who eats any blood will be outlawed from his people." Single quote. Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, "Speak to the Israelites and say, anyone who offers Yahweh a communion sacrifice must bring him part of his sacrifice as an offering. He must bring the food to be burnt for Yahweh, that is to say, the fat adhering to the forequarters, with his own hands. He will bring it, and also the forequarters, with which he will make the gesture of offering before Yahweh. The priest will then burn the fat on the altar, and the forequarters will revert to Aaron and his descendants. You will set aside the right thigh from your communion sacrifice and give it to the priest. The right thigh will be the portion of the descendant of Aaron who offers the blood and fat of the communion sacrifice. For I have deprived the Israelites of the forequarter offered and the thigh presented in their communion sacrifices, and given them to the priest Aaron and his descendants. This is a perpetual law for the Israelites." Single quote. Such was the portion of Aaron and his descendants in the food burnt for Yahweh, the day he presented them to Yahweh for them to become his priests. This was what Yahweh ordered the Israelites to give them on the day they were anointed, a perpetual law for all their descendants. Such was the ritual for burnt offering, cereal offering, sacrifice for sin, sacrifice of reparation, investiture sacrifice and communion sacrifice, which Yahweh laid down for Moses on Mount Sinai, the day he ordered the Israelites to make their offerings to Yahweh in the desert of Sinai.